Good afternoon. Welcome to our show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. It's been over a week since a jury convicted Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin of murder in the death of George Floyd. His family celebrated. Many others also shed tears of joy as the man we all watched kneel on and suffocate the life out of a black man was finally held accountable for it. But the verdict is far from the end of the broader subject of police brutality, which we are putting in focus today. Indigenous lives matter, Black lives matter, defund the police. All of these movements continue despite one officer being held accountable for killing a person of color. Inquiries, reviews into racism continue. The guests joining me today shed some light on what's happening now, what's going to happen next. You can lend your voice to the discussion too. You can call us toll free, 1-877-647-2786. You can comment on our Facebook Live feed, of course, too. That's on the APTN National News Facebook page. Before we get to our guests, you all had a lot to say online when we asked for your thoughts on the verdict. Here's our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko.
Thanks, Melissa. We collected some tweets after the Derek Chauvin verdict was announced. Let's take a look. Imani said, Derek Chauvin was a sacrifice to maintain the illusion that it's an individual, not the system that's at fault. Make no mistake, the system is at fault. Caroline tweeted, let's face it, he wouldn't have been charged if passers-by hadn't filmed him. It's not good enough. Let this be the beginning of accountability, not the end of the Chauvin trial. From Dr. Mary, today's verdict is an important step for individual accountability and justice, but we are not going to end police violence in courtrooms case by case. Mike tweeted, now more than ever, we need to stand with the vast majority of law enforcement officers who are good people working day and night to keep our communities safe. Derek Chauvin is the exception, not the rule. Lee Gazan, an MP in Winnipeg, said, my deepest respect goes out to the family, friends, and community of George Floyd. We mustn't stop until justice is realized for all Black lives and all form of systematic racism are eradicated. Lastly, from Sheldon, the images of George Floyd's death shocked our collective conscience, and the case against Mr. Chauvin was overwhelming. This is the right decision. If you would like to add your thoughts about the verdict, here's how. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts to InFocus at aptn.ca, like us on Facebook on our APTN News page, or follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks to all of you who shared that with us. Okay, joining us now, Sandy Hudson of Black Lives Matter Canada. She's currently based in LA, and she joins us from there. And Darren Thompson, he's the national correspondent with Native News Online, and he's joining us from his base in Arizona. So thank you guys both for joining us today. I want to, I'll start with you, Sandy. I want to ask you both this question. The first things that popped into your head when that verdict was read. Sandy?
Oh man, I had prepared myself the morning because I thought I had a feeling that the verdict was going to come down quite quickly. So I had a full slate of things to do that day. But as we do when these sorts of things happen, people in the Black community, and I'm sure people in the Indigenous community as well, I had to prepare myself for being able to function normally throughout the day, knowing what could happen. There was no preparation that worked. I still felt awful and quite hollow, which, perhaps that might be surprising to folks who are not Black or not Indigenous, who might think that such a verdict would just, make me happy. But it doesn't. It doesn't. It just leaves me feeling hollow because look at the bar that needed to be crossed to say that this man needed to be held accountable. It had to be caught on video. It had to be how long. It's just an enormous bar, and nothing about a conviction leads to the end of the cycle. It just means that we're waiting for the next person who's going to be killed by police, which in this case was on that very same day, a 15-year-old girl, Micaiah Bryant, in Ohio.
Yeah. Darren, I'm curious, as that verdict is read, what were your thoughts? What went through your mind?
Well, my thoughts were, thank goodness the system worked in this particular situation. You know, it was a sense of relief because I believe the city, as well as the rest of the world, was not exactly prepared for the outcome if a not guilty verdict were to come. And I say that to say, in the city of Minneapolis alone, which is where the trial was held, there were thousands of National Guard troopers on standby in the event of a not guilty verdict, because there were a lot of organizers, a lot of actions, and a lot of activity regarding calling for justice for this man, as well as to address the overall system of policing in the United States.
Yeah. You know, I know what you were saying, Sandy, about that numb feeling there was when the verdict was read. I felt nothing, really. It was like this, because this is what it should have been. So I feel like I'm not going to afford myself some joy when that's exactly how it should have been. We watched the guy do it, right? And then I was kind of a little bit taken aback by how many people were jubilant at this guilty verdict. And it just kind of made me look and go, maybe these people just all think it's all done. Like, we've washed our hands of it and we can all walk away. So I totally get what you're saying. And then that preparing for what if not, you know, and having to wear that for the day too. Like, what if he gets off? Then we're right back to, you know, what we all kind of know to be the case, right? Darren, I wanted to ask you, so you were based in the Twin Cities when all of this went down last Memorial Day in the middle of the pandemic. Take us back to watching this movement. So the George Floyd is killed. This Black Lives Matter movement starts building. You know, there was a lot of twists and turns and evolutions, and it ballooned in the span of a year. And you've been covering this. So, you know, just kind of, I'm curious, you know, notes from the reporter sort of thing, how you clocked it.
Sure. Well, this metro area has a poor history in interactions with people of color, of course, with law enforcement, and this wasn't the first situation. And as I discussed before, with the pandemic in its beginning stages, just started to ease up a bit. Even though numbers were still remarkably high, I believe that people were becoming hopeful because of the increasing weather temperatures. And as a result of that, there was more activity. And, you know, this was the unofficial kickoff of summer in the United States, of Memorial Day weekend. And sure enough, a Black man was recorded being knelt on by a white police officer that resulted in his death. And as a result of that, it led to many people in the streets. I think a lot of that had to do with the pandemic. I think a lot of people were frustrated with inactivity happening and arguments happening on partisan levels in the United States and in the state of Minnesota about what were the next best steps to deal with the pandemic. And then on top of that, you have, you know, another killing by a police officer to a person of color. And of course, you know, the video speaks for itself. And that was, you know, I actually didn't watch the video in its entirety for several days after it happened. Unfortunately, this is a pretty regular thing in this part of the country, and you know, it was a really traumatic thing just to see. And then, you know, I didn't need to see it to believe it per se, and you know, feeling the energy and feeling the people's, you know, voices in the streets was why I continue to take to the streets, as well as to cover this particular story from a variety of lenses. And I think that it was a very remarkable story to cover. as well as a very historical event that had happened in not only in this country but throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it took you, this wasn't just about what's happening in Minneapolis, right? And this wasn't just about, Black Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter. Then it got to dial it back to contact. We've got problems with the statues now, right? All of these things sort of just came out of building on the other. I have to ask you, Sandy, watching from Canada, I have to say it was bizarre to see how people divided on this issue. The response to Black Lives Matter being Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. It was shocking to see. I'm like, well, where the hell is all of this coming from? Like, aren't we just here talking about what we just saw happen? Like, somebody made the comparison. Of course, all lives matter, but, just like all houses matter. But if your house is on fire, or if their house is on fire, you're going to go and you want the firefighters to go put that one out. It's not about your house, which is safe and sound right now. So I like that comparison. But, as you're in States and you're watching this, Sandy, did it shock you at all? Because, you walk differently in this world than I do. Obviously, I look like a white lady. And then secondly, what does it tell us about America?
I thought that this year was a little bit different than we had seen in years previous. I've been involved in Black Lives Matter since its inception in 2013, and we've seen so much of exactly what you're talking about over the years. This all lives matter, the Blue Lives Matter, the are you Black supremacists? Ridiculous responses to this very simple affirmation that should be non-threatening. Black Lives Matter. Why would that be a threatening phrase to anybody unless they recognize that something has to change in the way that our society is structured in order for that to be not just an affirmation, but a societal truth. And I think that, some folks had a deep-seated fear about that, and that's where we saw some of those responses. Now, I say that this year was different because it seemed like summer 2020, we really broke through that. All of a sudden, it became really popular to say Black Lives Matter. The WNBA started a trend of folks in the sports arena and entertainment, claiming the phrase and saying it. And we were seeing it become popularized even in corporate America and beyond, which, none of us activists were really expecting. What I think we have an issue with today remaining is that it's not just an affirmation. It's a call to action to change our society. So then the next three words that were starting to become controversial is defund the police. We're not just saying Black Lives Matter so that you can say it and put it on a shirt and get some clout and get everybody to know that, hey, you think the situation is bad too. We are saying we want society to change. You have to take some sort of action. And the resistance to that piece is really, really dangerous. We need to change society. If we are going to get rid of this cycle of just waiting for the next death, waiting for the next crisis, I don't want to do that anymore. I can't do that anymore. I can't live through that. As Darren said, it took him some time to watch the video. I didn't see the George Floyd video until the trial. I just couldn't. I could not bring myself to watch it. And it's awful to exist in this place where you're just waiting for the next thing because society refuses to reckon with the way that it is set up, such that it continues this cycle of abuse and violence against Black people.
You had actually told me something that I did not know, that there's these two kind of acts that have come out of this. There's the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, and then there's the Breathe Act. If you could just give us a quick rundown, like what's the difference? Because one is we've kind of, seems like we've already tried, and then one is completely new. If you could take a stab at explaining that, dumbing it down for us.
Yeah, I mean, you put it so well. One has already been tried. And so a lot of people, I think, in Canadian media over the last week will have heard of the Justice and Policing Act. It is the one that is named after George Floyd and is the one that I think has some deep, deep fundamental flaws. It, if passed, will send hundreds of millions of dollars into policing for training, anti-bias training, for body cameras, for the elimination or like the regulation of the way that police do chokeholds, so making certain types banned. And what we know is that those measures don't work. The chokehold that was used by a police officer to murder Eric Garner in New York was banned. Didn't matter. Still killed him. Derek Chauvin was looking into a camera as he killed George Floyd. Yeah. Didn't matter. Still killed him. Anti-bias training, I mean, come on. There's no amount of hour-long trainings that would have stopped Derek Chauvin from murdering George Floyd and all of these other people who have experienced this violence at the hands of police. Anti-bias training has been being given to police for decades now. It doesn't make an impact. Now, the Breathe Act, what it tries to do is to remove funding from the police and put that funding into different measures of creating safety and security in our society. So that might mean a new emergency service for people who are experiencing mental health crises, or providing new services for people who are experiencing gender-based violence or domestic violence, which is an issue that the police hardly do well at even responding to right now. That's the kind of thing that we haven't tried, taking power away from the police to enact their violence against members of our community by defunding them and putting that funding into better methods of creating safety.
Well, and I want to get into the defunding element of all of this, which I've always kind of felt was a really sort of unfortunate marketing label that's been put on it, because I think it shuts out a lot of people who otherwise, if they knew what it was all about, they might be more inclined to listen and understand and to support it. We have, I think, something here. We've got a show, or we've got a story here on defunding the police. I think it was, this one is out of, this is from the gained momentum here in Canada, the June 2020 shooting of Chantal Moore out in the East Coast. This happened, but when the RCMP went to conduct a wellness check. So I wanted to just take a look back at that story. It was kind of how, defund the police movement really sort of flourished here. And up to this point, it had just been, we'd been watching it down south of the border. Take a look.
A lone sign at Friday's Black Lives Matter protest in Ottawa has a list of names and a call to action at the bottom of it. One that a Vancouver-based advocate agrees with.
I think, again, we could see this shift from what we have right now, which is police attending crisis calls. In the cases of Chantal Moore and Reggie Krichinsky-Paquette, they were attending, doing wellness checks, and they obviously weren't able to support the wellness, right? These women died.
Meenak Shimano spoke about defunding Vancouver police at this town hall a year ago. She's a police accountability critic for the Pivot Legal Society and believes huge police budgets spent elsewhere would reduce crime.
If we were to redistribute funds from policing into better welfare rates, basic income rates, could we start to see like a downstream trend towards low-level property crimes?
La Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchette and Conservative leader Andrew Scheer were both asked about this idea.
So adding resources to fight racism is something. Reducing the resources provided to police corps is something else, which might make our communities somewhat more vulnerable.
I don't believe that defunding the RCMP would make Canadians safer. I believe that we have to look at aspects within our police forces and stamp out systemic racism where it exists and put in measures to ensure that nobody is mistreated or treated differently.
Minot doesn't buy those arguments.
So when we hear, political leaders say that this is actually going to contribute to a lack of safety, I'm thinking about how people are dying, right, at the hands of police or shortly after being in police custody. That, to me, speaks of a lack of safety.
Prime Minister Trudeau wasn't asked specifically about defunding the police, but said his government has brought in, among other things, new oversight of the RCMP and promised to do more. Paul Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
So, Sandy, I've got a bunch of questions here for Darren, but I just want to finish up with Sandy about the defunding police. How do you explain this concept to somebody who would think that defunding the police means that you don't have protection? And it's, of course, probably the people who think like that are people who don't live in impoverished neighborhoods, don't have, they're white-skinned. It's not their kids that are dying in these interactions with police. How do you explain to these people, though, what defunding the police actually entails and how it would work and how it doesn't take anything from them? It doesn't mean that the police aren't there when you phone 911 because someone's breaking into your house. How do you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, to so many people, the police are a theoretical concept. They're not a force that they interact with on a daily basis. For other folks, people of Black communities and a lot of Indigenous communities will be interacting with police all the time. And so they actually have an idea beyond what Hollywood tells us of what the police actually do. And so for all your listeners, I will say that Black Lives Matter Canada has created a resource so that people can really understand what we mean when we're talking about this. It's called defundthepolice.org, and we encourage you to take a look because there's lots of different information there. But the biggest thing that is useful for us to understand as part of this is the role that the police actually play in our society. We might think that they are the force that's there to respond to every call, every robbery, to solve crime, to make sure that we're safe, because that's what we see on television. But the reality is that that is actually not how police operate, and it can be jarring to see the numbers and accept that truth. So for an example, most people won't know this, but this is a Statistics Canada statistic, that upwards of 80% of what the police deal with are non-criminal calls in nature, most of those being mental health calls. So why is it that the number one emergency response that we have for people who are going through a mental health crisis is police? They don't deal with those crises well. Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, another Indigenous man who was killed on the East Coast, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, DeAndre Campbell, these are all people who were experiencing a mental health crisis when police killed them. We need to take all of the billions of dollars that we put into police and take some of that money to create a new emergency service that's going to deal with mental health. Even things like robbery, theft, and arson, the police are solving in those cases very few of those so-called crimes, right? Like the police lay a charge in less than 20% of those issues. Less than 20%. Your insurance company is more useful to you.
It's time to redistribute the how we're dealing with these things. I get the point. Like when you get into it makes sense to me. But it was that initial label is takes people aback.
I think also, though, it's not just redistributing, it's getting to the root of the problem. Because if the root of the problem is that people are, for example, poor or don't have proper housing, let's put the money into that to make sure that those things don't happen. And I will say, in terms of the naming of the campaign, Defund the Police, we've been trying different names since 2013. We tried Reinvest, didn't take on. Retool, didn't take on. divest, didn't take on. It wasn't until we said defund that somehow people started talking about it. So I would come back at you and say, I think this is one of the most effective campaign languages that we have come up with, because we're actually having the conversation now, whereas before everyone was ignoring us.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Here we are having this conversation. Darren, I want to ask you, you're an Indigenous man living in the States. You now have an Indigenous woman, Deb Haaland, in cabinet there. What do you anticipate the effect is going to be on the situation that you have in the U.S.?
The effect as in having an Indigenous woman in the cabinet?
Yeah, like, is this gonna change anything? Because I mean, there's
Sure.
massive race divisions there, and seemingly people not willing to acknowledge that there is systemic racism within various facets of your country. Can Deb Haaland make a difference?
Sure, great question, and there's a great example. As her role as Madam Secretary, Deborah Haaland's first action was she created a collaborative initiative with the Department of Justice, which is a separate department here in the States, to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so that, of course, was partnered with the Department of Interior, which overall oversees Indian lands as well as Indian trust lands, which is a pretty significant percentage of geographical landscape here in the United States. So starting from there, depending on what the statistics and how they are revealed, I believe there will be additional changes as well as trainings provided on various jurisdictional challenges as well as policing, in particular Indian country. And that's the challenge here in the United States, is that according to the United States Census Bureau, the majority of Indigenous people live off of Indian land. In other words, they live in cities, and most of the cities here in the United States are not particularly on trust land or are on Indian reservations. Mm-hmm. And so there's the challenge, and of course disseminating the data as well as looking through it and then determining what type of actions or interactions that law enforcement has with people who identify as Indigenous and or Native American. So, you have those challenges, and I think that looking at this data, I think, will be something that will be addressed, particularly with the new Census Bureau being taken, and it just was released here in the United States a few weeks ago, and that is going through some changes in regards to who sits in Congress and, different political representation here in the United States. And I definitely think that with the re-implementation of the Tribal Nations Summit with President Biden, I think that there will be some additional changes with the Department of Interior as well as the Department of Justice here in the United States.
Well, I'm going to have to cut you guys off there. We have to take a break, but I'm hopeful that we have a lot to be looking forward to in terms of action to come out of this. Thank you guys both for joining us. When we come back, we are going to talk to columnist Doug Cuthand about the Indigenous Lives Matter movement here in Canada, along with the defunded police notion of that. And later on in the show, we've got Martha Martin. She joins us. She's the mother of Chantel Moore, who was killed by police during a wellness check about last June. Stay with us.
Now, call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back. I've got an old story to show you from the East Coast back in June 2020. But before I get to that, we want to go to, we've got a caller, Catherine. Catherine, you're there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Catherine. You wanted to add your voice to the conversation?
Yes, to the police brutality.
Mm-hmm.
I had worked as a court worker for the Mi'kmaq Nation in the all in the East Coast in Quebec and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia at one point. And I was driving behind a police car, and I knew a young man walking on the sidewalk. I knew where he was going, and I was going to give him a lift. Before I can do that, the two policemen jumped out of the car, beat the crap right out of him. So I followed them right to the police station, and they told me to mind my own business, that he resisted arrest. I says, I don't see how anybody can resist an arrest when you handcuffed him immediately before he knew what hit him, and then you started beating him.
So when you hear this these types of conversations that we're now having, more than ever, do you think it was, overdue that we're having these conversations? Do you think anything is going to come of the discussions that we're having?
It's way overdue. It's way overdue. But I have said, in my time, I'm a Native person, and in my mind, we've been in contact with the Europeans since 400 years, 500 years. And they brought with them this racism, and it is a genetic disease with them. You can't get a needle like we do for COVID for those people.
Yeah.
They live like that. They believe it.
Thanks for calling, Catherine. So as we're talking, 2 Indigenous people were killed by police in June 2020. That's on the East Coast. Both stemmed from calls over mental health concerns. We want to take a look back at a story done by Angel Moore at the time.
Rodney Levi was a 48-year-old father of 3 from Nettamanagia First Nation. He was shot by RCMP after officers were called to a home in Sunny Corner near Miramichi and died shortly after in hospital. Chief Bill Ward says his community is looking for answers.
I think they just called the cops just to have him peacefully removed, I think maybe, but it wasn't anything from what I'm hearing. There's no threats or violence or...
At the scene, officers say they were confronted by a man carrying a knife. The RCMP said Saturday their officer deployed a taser but was unsuccessful, and then an officer reportedly fired his gun and Levi died around 9 p.m. Linda Levi, Rodney's older sister, said Rodney lived with mental illness. She believes the RCMP overreacted and that her brother should still be alive.
We need to bring back our own policing. We need our own policing back. We don't need no more RCMPs to do more damage than they already have.
Levi's fatal shooting is the second in just a week. Chantel Moore was fatally shot on June 4th by an Edmundston police officer during a mental wellness check. Tensions are high, and Chief Ward is asking RCMP officers to stay out of the community.
People need time to grieve, and especially with everything happening, there was already a distrust there for the RCMP, unfortunately, and this has only solidified that.
The Quebec police watchdog is investigating both Levi and Moore's deaths. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Tuktoyaktuk, Halifax.
I'm joined now by columnist Doug Cuthand. He's in Saskatchewan, joining us. Doug, the issue of police brutality against people of color in Canada, particularly Indigenous people, when we're talking about Western Canada and the prairies, it's not new. We had the Starlight tours in Saskatoon, police driving Indigenous people outside city limits, leaving them in freezing conditions. We had the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry here in Manitoba for the handling of the Helen Betty Osborne murder, the investigation of police who killed J.J. Harper. Yet here we are, 2021, still having this same conversation, stuff that you've been writing about. We're going on 3 or 4 decades. What do you? Are we getting anywhere? It feels like with 30, 40 years of everybody saying we might have some problems, and we're still saying we might have some problems.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far we're getting. I think. Yeah, you're right. Correct. There's been, I know in Saskatoon here, they had a new police chief come in and they cleaned up a lot of stuff, but it still happens that there's people roughed up on the streets and stuff like this. Racism runs very deep in the prairies here, and our people always seem to be on the receiving end of it. So I think there's a lot that has to be done. The RCMP has got to look at their own history. They're essentially set up in the West, the Indians in their place, clear the West part settlement, and a lot of that a lot of that still exists in the mindset and in the history and the corporate culture of the RCMP. And a lot of that is carried over into the cities as well.
Yeah. And it's not just about, dying at the hands of police. Indigenous people say that they feel underserved by police too. If you phone when you're a victim of crime or something, you don't get the same treatment that some other people get. We hear from MMIWG families that say, police didn't take seriously when we called to report this person missing, or didn't treat the murder investigation with any sense of urgency. We had Chief Alan Adam on video roughed up by police over an expired license plate. There's a whole lot of the complaints aren't just about you're more likely to die at the hands of police. The complaints are wide within the issue of systemic racism within anything, whether it's healthcare or policing. It's not just one thing. There's a bunch. Police have been taking cultural awareness training over the last 20 years. Why isn't anything? It's not fixed yet. What's your theory?
Well, I don't think cultural awareness training, it's really taken seriously by the RCMP. A lot of these guys coming in as new recruits really aren't fixated in that direction at all. And I think one of the problems we have out here in the West, on the prairies, is that the land is being depopulated. The farmers are moving off the land and retiring or going to the cities or whatnot, and the small towns are drying up. So as a result, the RCMP is cutting back in their numbers, and it just takes a long time to get any kind of response out of them if there is an issue that has to be dealt with. On my reserve, which is Little Pine, and other reserves in my area, we're going to self-policing. We have our own security, which is basically taking care of our elders and looking after people and seeing that things are safe on the reserve. Still, they're not entitled to do the work of the criminal code that the RCMP does, but they still do make a difference, and it's quite meaningful, actually.
And how many people have they killed?
Who?
The First Nations security that you have there that are dealing with some of the calls.
Oh, no, they haven't killed anybody. Of course, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah,
the people know each other and they respect each other, and they don't look like like the RCMP arrive on a reserve. They're like an army, that's taking control. Whereas our people, when they're there, they're just part of the community, and they work from the inside out.
Yeah, and a lot of communities are seeing exactly that sort of thing. We just had a story by Sarah Connors, our Yukon reporter, just did a big feature up there. They've got said we don't want federal police in here as much anymore. We want to just do it ourselves with the security force, and they've had nothing but good luck with that. Global News is reporting a poll today that shows that 84% of Canadians feel that the Chauvin verdict is going to lead to improved policing practices here in Canada. What do you make of that? 84% think this will be somehow good for police relations, police and BIPOC relations here in Canada. What do you think?
Well, it's amazing how much the Chauvin trial was watched in Canada. And I think a lot of people resonate with a lot of people. Whether it's going to make a change, I'm not so sure, because we're talking about a huge bureaucracy here. And we're not just talking about the police. We are looking at the entire justice system, right from the police up to the jail guards and everybody in between. The whole system is, is biased. The whole system is racist. It needs a complete overhaul. So the police are just part of this, and just by separating out one group doesn't address the entire issue. And that's what we have to be looking at. It's a whole big picture, not just one individual case like the Chauvin case, or there's lots of other examples, believe me. But rather than settle for the one example, let's go for the change in the whole system.
And do you feel that there's an appetite for change? You know, not just among Indigenous people, but the Canadians more broadly. Do you think they're going, yeah, I think that this is the time for change to happen?
Well, there's always been an appetite for change among our own people because of the brunt
obviously.
Of it. But on the other hand, I think that there is, I don't know how much, but I think there is a growing awareness, and with awareness comes wanting change. So yeah, I think it's moving, but it's too slow. It's not very much.
Well, thank you, Doug. It's always great to chat with you, and we will have you back on sooner rather than later. I feel like it's been a long time since we've seen you on here. I think it's important to note that a news story that came out of the U.S. this week of a police officer that was fired from his job after hackers found that he donated money to the defense of accused killer Kyle Rittenhouse, who you'll recall armed himself and gunned down allegedly black protesters in support of Blue Lives Matter. So here's a story from 13 News Now in Virginia.
And now to breaking news from Norfolk. A police officer is fired after reportedly donating to the defense fund of a teen charged with killing 2 people in a protest against police brutality. Lieutenant William Kelly is off the force tonight.
The police chief put Kelly on administrative leave last week after the reports first surfaced. The Guardian found a donation and message of support associated with Kelly's official email address on Kyle Rittenhouse's defense fund. Rittenhouse is accused of killing 2 people during protests after the Jacob Blake shooting in Wisconsin.
In a statement, Norfolk Police Chief Larry Boone said he knows a police department can't do its job when it loses the public's trust. But he's asking the community for support and to trust that police will represent and uphold values like honor, integrity, and equality.
Thank God for hackers sometimes, because that's who found out that donation was made. Okay, let's go now to social media again with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear some more of what you had to say.
So on Facebook, we asked what the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin meant to you, and also whether this was the beginning of police accountability. Here's what you had to say. First from Lori. Hard to say, really. It's a start. However, there was little to dispute in the never-ending videos during the trial that clearly showed Chauvin's guilt. I only hope he gets the maximum sentence. Billy said, cop was just thrown under the bus by his own system to appease the masses. This means nothing. Edward commented, honestly, it means nothing, just a dirty cop off the streets. From Dave, the verdict was handed out of fear, not justice if you ask me. They made him a martyr, end of story. Daryl said, cops are like weeds, pull one out, 2 more pop up. Lastly from Karina, accountability. It is the start to accountability. It is never justice when a life has been lost, but it is holding unjustified people accountable. Thank you to everyone that shared their thoughts. If you want to share your thoughts on the verdict, here's how. Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Thank you, Jesse. Well, I wanted to tell you about a story that the Tyee broke recently. A year ago, the news outlet filed a Freedom of Information request to find out how much the RCMP spends investigating missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. It took a year, but they got a response to that Freedom of Information request that didn't show much for what was spent, but it did show, or reveal, I guess, sort of a lack of a national strategy to solve crimes against Indigenous females. So the Tyee went on to quote a criminologist who said that it is, quote, surprising that in light of the growing awareness about violence against Indigenous women following Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, that it's surprising that we're still, the federal police force is still not there, kind of looking at how do we handle these things. So something to watch, and of course we here at APTN do keep our eyes on these things, and we will keep the conversation going. So obviously police need to be involved in conversations like we're having today. We reached out to 3 police departments with large urban indigenous populations to invite them on to talk about, where do we go from here? What are police themselves taking from what we've learned from the, these movements and watch these movements gain ground? What are police talking about? Both the Edmonton Police Service and the Saskatoon Police Service said that they're interested in the discussion but couldn't do it today. The Winnipeg Police Service said that they are not doing interviews on this topic. And they sent us a 2-sentence statement from the police chief saying, quote, Derek Chauvin's actions against George Floyd were egregious. Minnesota prosecutors have held him accountable for Floyd's murder. Justice has been served. So that's that. We need to take another break, but when we come back, Martha Martin, the mother of Chantel Moore, who was killed during a police wellness check, she's going to join us. Stay with us. Edmonton, New Brunswick police received a call back in June 2020 to do a wellness check on a woman. When they got there, they were confronted by a woman that they say was holding a knife and making threats. The officer fired their gun, and she died on the scene. Chantel Moore is that woman, and Chantel's mom joins Martha Martin. She joins us now. Martha, thanks for joining us. So the Crown Attorney is reviewing the shooting that took your daughter. As that's going on, how did it feel to watch the Derek Chauvin trial and verdict in the U.S. last week?
Oh, it kind of gives you hope to believe that, there's a possibility that justice can be served, that people aren't always willing to turn a blind eye.
Do you believe that more people are starting to understand or pay notice at all to systemic racism, especially as it pertains to policing?
Oh, it's starting to. I think there's still a long road ahead of us, for it to be completely out there and people acknowledging it completely and not just brushing it under the carpet.
An internal investigation found no wrongdoing on the part of the officer who shot Chantel. The Crown is looking at it, though. Where's that at?
I'm still waiting, and this is months after. So I received the call on December 23rd saying that the DEI had handed over their case to the Crown. And I still haven't heard anything back from the Crown.
In our discussion, you had made a point that I thought was interesting about, police receive 6 months or a year training and then are handed a gun, and it takes 7 years
and it takes a lawyer. 7 years. So why aren't these laws changed for the police as well? They have to know the law in 6 months. There's no way that's possible. A lawyer's gone for 7 years and a cop can go for 6 months.
Do you think that training will fix it, though? Is that something that you think that, just longer training would be the solution to, the I guess, brutality that we're seeing so often that's our people are on the receiving end of?
I think so. More training and being able to hold our police for accountability. What does that look like in the future? Them wearing body cams so that nothing like this happens anymore, where it's a one-sided story and you have only the cop side of the version and the deceased isn't here to defend themselves.
How do you feel, as this all took off with George Floyd and then, Black Lives Matter, and then from that came the Defund the Police movement. Where do you stand on any of this? I mean, Chantel was killed, kind of in the midst of this, I guess. you know, where do you stand on the whole notion of defunding police and taking those resources and putting them in other places?
Putting them in different places where they're needed. You know, like when you have a wellness call, do you really need to send a police who's armed to the teeth? And then you have somebody who's already going through something, and then you're throwing a police in there with a gun. So why not take a different avenue and try something different, because this isn't working with the police.
Who do you think would have been better suited to attend that call to check on Chantal that day?
Well, this is the one thing, you know, when they say a wellness check, she was not trying to harm herself. They believed that somebody was there who was stalking her. You know, so I think when you look on a wellness check, you kind of have to think about what that person going through. Are they suicidal? Do they need maybe mental health to step in and maybe aid the police? And it's hard to say because, you know, wellness checks are not all the same.
Yeah. Well, Martha, we thank you for taking time to join us today, and we'll be talking to you, of course, when you hear back from the Crown Attorney there.
Okay, for sure. And now I have your email, so
yeah,
once I hear back more, I'll keep in touch with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Martha.
All right, you take care. Stay safe.
We're all out of time. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon.